Welcome to the Korea Society and welcome to Studio Korea. We're delighted to have you in our studio audience and listening online or viewing via YouTube. And we're especially delighted today to have one of Korea's most talented diplomats roaming as well as academicians, and that is Ambassador and Professor Lee Jung-hoon. Welcome back to the Korea Society. We're delighted to have you here.
It's great to be back.
Thank you. Ambassador Lee has been now in the last few days noted in some major publications, including an article in Time magazine, in particular in terms of note with your testimony on the Hill to the House subcommittee led by Chris Smith and your important contribution in that setting. So we're very happy to have had you in Washington and that you've taken the time to be with us in New York. Also, by way of welcome, I'd like to acknowledge Ambassador Han, the Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations, as well as our distinguished board member, Dr. Young Chung, who is with us today. Ambassador Lee, I'd like to start with something of an update. You were with us last year, but now we have had the release of the United Nations Commission of Inquiry report and some other interesting developments on the North Korea human rights front. I wonder if you wanted to start with a few observations.
Right. The last time that I was here was to participate in the UN General Assembly, the third committee, and our discussions included what will follow, what kind of contents will be included in the COI report, and what could be expected, what kind of effect will be expected. Well, we've had the report, which was publicly released in March this year. And it's been a sort of a whirlwind type of an effect thereafter. Tremendous focus on North Korean human rights. Perhaps you might say that even more than one might have anticipated. A few things of noteworthy, I would say, is the 2 days after the report got online on the 17th of February, Botswana, one of the countries in Africa, severed its diplomatic relations with North Korea, basically saying that we cannot have a formal diplomatic relations with a country that commits crimes against humanity. And therein lies, of course, one of the most important findings of the COI, which is that in this country, in North Korea, that crimes against humanity is being committed. And what is unique about the North Korean situation is that it's not like some other countries where you have civil wars or civil upheaval and crimes of this type last for, say, 2-3 years or 4-5 years. No, in North Korea, this has continued on systematically, sponsored by the state for nearly 7 decades. I mean, that's what makes it so unique in North Korea, that this has been going on for nearly 7 decades. And Justice Kirby, Michael Kirby, the chairperson of the COI report, was of the opinion that there's no parallel in the international community. The degree of atrocity is just mind-boggling, and that it is now time that he finds it really astounding that somehow North Korea has been able to divert the attention, unlike some other countries. I mean, you would think that the international community would be very much on this issue, like, for example, Rwanda or the Cambodia, the killing fields, apartheid, South Africa, and certainly, of course, after World War II, Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. That's the kind of attention that this situation deserves, but it has somehow sort of been able to avert, and that the time is high for the UN and the international community to really look into this issue and kick in a prosecutory mechanism so that those responsible will be held to justice.
That's fascinating. And we here at the Korea Society are very happy to hear that, in that we have committed quite a bit to this issue of North Korean human rights, including the release of Blaine Hardin's Escape from Camp 14, which focused on the tale of Shin Dong-hyuk, who also testified
Yes.
after you the other day in Washington, and testified before the committee as well. Just this last Wednesday evening, we had a session on the violence against women aspect of the Commission of Inquiry report. And so our commitment here is very deep. We're fortunate to be located near the United Nations. Many of the people in our studio audience today work with human rights NGOs. And so that sounds like a very clarion call for accountability. One of the initial stumbling blocks after the release seemed to be China's opposition, and seemed to be the question of the referral to the ICC. Although it seems that in recent days there's been discussion that the ICC might be able to pursue this on an investigatory way, leading to some sort of prosecution without a referral from the Security Council. Is that correct?
No, I think, well, if the top prosecutor took the initiative to really pursue this on his own, it is technically possible. But because North Korea is not a member signatory to the Roman Statute, that it would require the UN Security Council referral to the ICC, and China, unfortunately, remains a stumbling block at this juncture. And I might also add that the COI report, of the several recommendations and commentaries in it, was very specific about China and how China continues to get involved in sending back forcibly the North Korean refugees or defectors, if you will. That amounts to aiding and abetting the crimes against humanity. That's a very, very serious charge. And you have to give it to Michael Kirby, who had the courage. I mean, at the UN, it's very, very diplomatic. And China, of course, assumes a very influential position, not only in the UN, but in the global political economic activities. So one's very cagey and one's very diplomatic in approaching China. And yet there was the Chinese delegation sitting on the 17th of March when the final report was being given. And he was very specific and pointing to the Chinese delegation that they are, they face the risk of being charged by the international community for aiding and abetting crimes against humanity. So that's a very, very courageous thing to do. And I believe that China is feeling the pressure. And it does have the veto. And the general expectation at this juncture is that if it does get taken up by the UN Security Council, that China would veto it. But how many times can they do that? The thing is, if it keeps coming up. And one has to keep in also mind that, unlike Russia, China has been very judicious in its use of veto. I think only recently the veto against the Syrian case was the 10th in the entirety. And therefore, as a G2, as a country that wants to lead the world head and head with the United States, to continue to be portrayed as a country that's being a patron to this rogue state, particularly a state that commits crimes against humanity, does not look well. And I think not only to the international community, but I suspect that even within China, the netizens, the younger generation of the Chinese people, are beginning to raise questions. What is our government doing? Why are we doing this at the risk of really undercutting our national interest? So this is, I'm sure, a huge pressure on China to continue to veto this thing. So I'm not overly pessimistic about the possible passage of this referral to the ICC by the Security Council.
I was recently in a closed-door meeting, track two, an unofficial meeting of people active in the analysis community, and one of the suggestions was that we raise the carrying cost on China. Specifically cited was, if China will veto once, why not just bring a resolution, 40 days in a row, and make them and force them to have to veto over it, where then the carrying cost becomes
Yeah.
too high.
Yeah, I will fully agree that it may veto once or twice, but if it keeps coming up, for
Mhm.
China to continue to veto 5 times, 7 times, is a huge, as you say, carrying cost. That's And I think that's going to be a huge problematic issue for China, not only in the international community, but as I said earlier, in the domestic political context as well.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
And one would think that given the success of President Park Geun-hye's meeting with President Xi Jinping last year, what appears to be a high level of respect, that one would certainly hope that Seoul and Beijing are consulting actively on how to do that. One would certainly hope the new Chinese leadership begins to ask that question: what is in it for us
Mm.
when they get to that critical point? Let me ask you about the Human Rights Office in Seoul. This is something that North Korea has come out on at least two occasions now and offered some rather harsh comments about. But what do you see in terms of the development of that relative to the report and its mandate?
Well, that's another very, very important step forward. There were some issues of whether this will be held, whether this office will be in Korea or maybe even Thailand or elsewhere, but that's been finally settled. It will be in Korea, most likely in Seoul. And I think it's going to have a tremendous effect in dealing with the North Korean human rights issue. I think it will be the center sort of point, venue, if you will. It will carry on the works of COI because, as you know, officially, the COI's role has ended as of the end of March. But that work will continue in the form of the UN field office structure that's going to be set up in Korea, hopefully sometimes in fall this year. And some of the functions that's been talked about, clearly, of course, the most important thing is to keeping track and registering the cases of violations of human rights. I think it will have um, similar effects to the registrar that was set up in West Germany, in Salzgitter, keeping track of what the East Germans were doing in terms of their human rights violations. And in the end, there were over 40,000 cases that were registered. And I think that this had a tremendous effect psychologically on those perpetrators. So the violators would think twice before shooting at some of the East Germans crossing over the wall to escape East Germany into West Germany or elsewhere. So we're hoping that the setup of this office will have that kind of effect on those North Koreans who are maybe prison guards at one of these heinous North Korean prison camps, and other bureaucrats before they commit yet another human rights violation, that they will think twice, thinking that my name is being registered. My acts somehow through the defectors' testimonies or what have you are being looked into. And when Korea is reunified, that they will be held to justice. And that, I think, is a tremendous psychological deterrent, and we're hoping that that kind of deterrence will work. Other functions that we can expect from this office will be the office playing a central role for the networking of the North Korean human rights civil societies. It will also help to advertise the North Korean human rights issue because the international awareness, despite the atrocities, is much less than it really ought to be. So that's another function that the that we're expecting the office to take place. So we're very excited about the office coming to Korea. This is a UN office, and I think it will be until the day that we reunify and
Sure.
there's an improvement in the human rights conditions, that this will be the center point. That's why North Koreans are very upset about it. And as you mentioned, they've had very, very harsh threats against all those who are involved in the setup of this UN office. Why are they upset? Well, they know that this is something that's going to hurt them. So they feel it. They're keenly aware. They don't want what they're doing to be found out by the outside world. And this is going to keep a very keen, scrutinizing eye on North Korea, and they don't like it.
Sure.
That's why they're so upset.
Sure. And with 120,000 people in that gulag-type system, with Nazi-era type atrocities, to use Michael Kirby's suggestion in the report and in the summary, one would think that the pressure and the demands of accountability are such that it could provide a very clear wake-up call. I'm interested in that aspect as well in terms of mechanisms on the peninsula for integration. And perhaps what you're suggesting is we may be in a system where there is an end game to this, and the North Koreans are sensing this. For purposes of integration and eventual unification, it seems that it's signaling that there will be demands for accountability, and it seems that there's a process being laid that hasn't existed in the past. That seems to be a very important development. Wondering if you could, so much of what you've said hinges on public attitude. And one of the things the Commission of Inquiry did well through its Seoul testimonials was raise awareness among South Korean people. Certainly some of the books we've mentioned, like Escape from Camp 14, have caused what some of us see as a watershed in American thinking. And do you have thoughts on where the South Korean public is in terms of their awareness, maybe especially among younger people, about atrocities that are being committed only an hour or an hour and a half away from Seoul?
Well, the thing is that it just seems so surreal. We're the same people, same genetic code. But I think there was a very telling satellite aerial photo at night of South Korea and the Korean peninsula. The northern half is pitch black, dark, no electricity. In the southern half is bright, shining light. And this is happening in this small Korean peninsula, same people, as a result of the different political system that's in the north and in the south. So a lot of the younger generation, the public, not quite aware of what's going on as much as they should be. So I go on lectures a lot, not only in this sort of symposiums, but also in high schools, to raise the awareness. And in fact, once they get a taste of understanding what's going on in North Korea, their interest is multiplies and it expands. So for the younger generation, human rights issue is a very, very interesting issue for these kids, and they're very much concerned about it. So although I would argue that it may be, quote unquote, in a nascent stage, it is expanding. And I believe that at some point that the younger generation will take this up at a much more sophisticated level than it is taken up at this juncture. Could I just add that you were earlier mentioning about my visit to Washington, D.C., just before my coming to New York. Because I take a government official position, it wasn't really, technically speaking, a testimony. Shin Dong-hyuk and others were doing the testimony. My role was more briefing. It was technically called the briefing. And the most important thing that I unveiled at the hearing was the findings of the Hogan levels.
Mm-hmm.
which is the London-based, very large global international law firm, which the Human Liberty, which is the institute that I founded in Korea earlier this year, commissioned the Hogan Lovells to study the COI report, and it came up with a second opinion, completely endorsing the findings and recommendations of the COI. But it goes a step further, which is that the Hogan Lovells finding and the report, which is about 100 pages long,
Mm-hmm.
that there are grounds to warrant crimes on genocide,
Mm-hmm.
that there is enough evidences to suggest that in North Korea there's genocide. It's not just crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity, yes. But as you know, COI went thus far to the crimes against humanity, but it didn't delve into the genocide part because of the time limit of 1 year of investigation and so on. But these lawyers who are working pro bono found that there may be enough evidences to suggest genocide. Why? Because there's this hostile class in North Korea
Mm-hmm.
that's referred to as the songbun, the treating, you're born into this caste.
Yeah.
Yeah,
As well.
and they are therefore cultural ethnicity
Mm-hmm.
within North Korea who are all their life systematically discriminated against. And crimes of attrition, starvation can apply to this group, and therefore genocide can apply. Another area that it looked very closely into is the Christians in North
Mm-hmm.
Korea. Before Korean War, as you know, there were more Christian population in the north than in the south. There's practically none. And those who do practice Christianity, it's completely underground. But we know that one of your tourists earlier, American tourist,
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Fowl, was held as prisoner because he left his Bible
Mm-hmm.
in his hotel room. There were 33 North Koreans who were charged in aiding and helping out South Korean Baptist reverend by the name of Kim Jong-un, and they were summarily executed, publicly executed last November
Mm-hmm.
when widespread purging was going on. So this is over 30 people
Mm-hmm.
charged for trying to create underground churches in North Korea. Now, if that's not genocide, I understand that genocide, the term itself, is very, very narrow. But if that's not genocide, I don't know what is.
Sure.
There's, of course, another group that should be protected, which is the non sort of Korean ethnic group. These are Korean, these are sort of babies,
Mm-hmm.
infants, women who cross over into China
Mm-hmm.
and they marry Chinese, or some in some cases they get raped. Anyways, they carry children
Mm-hmm.
that's mixed, Chinese and Koreans, and these children are targeted as somehow being, you know, hostile to the society. So they're subjected to forced abortion
Mm-hmm.
and infanticide.
Sure.
Yeah. So this particular group also ought to be protected, ought to be categorized as protected groups. So if you're looking at these three categories,
Mm-hmm.
Christians, non-ethnic Koreans, and hostile class by Songbun,
Mm-hmm.
there are enough to warrant genocide going on in North Korea. So why do I, put an emphasis on genocide? Because somehow for the general public audience, they're more aware of the of what is genocide as opposed to crimes against humanity.
Right.
Crimes against humanity, we understand what it is, but for the general public, what is crimes against humanity? But genocide, it rings a bell. The Holocaust,
Right.
killing fields, so on and so forth, Rwanda.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that's why I'm putting a heavy emphasis on this aspect. It still needs to be debated, but we feel very strongly
Sure.
that this is something that we should pursue as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Important clarification. And by way of footnote, for anyone interested in that third aspect, we did have Roberta Cohen here who provided the testimonial to the COI Commission on that aspect of the women's vulnerability and the forced abortions.
Right.
And we did have an excellent program chaired by Nikita Desai, our policy program here last Wednesday. And for those listening online or viewing on YouTube, I would refer that program to them. But what you are moving us to is a very important call. And the analogy, the link directly to the Holocaust, to the killing fields, to Rwanda, Srebrenica, the apartheid era, is never again. And that is a very important message. And how we in 2014 can move that forward in terms of accountability and awareness, and ultimately the freedom and the protection for the peoples of North Korea. And that's not only a Korean interest, but really very much a universal human interest.
Yeah.
And Ambassador Lee Jung-hoon, this is where we will conclude. We'll allow a little room for some of the individuals in this audience to meet and question you one-on-one. I see there are a few hands still in our audience, but this is the end of our recording time, and we wanted to thank you for returning to the Korea Society. The Korea Society was founded 60 years ago by General Van Fleet, people like Henry Luce, William Randolph Hearst, Ben Lim, the first ambassador to the United Nations, the first Bank of Korea representatives, and other mid-century American luminaries. And one of the values they placed on it coming out of the Korean War and the World War II era was the emphasis on dignity for the Korean peoples. And you very much here in 2014 offer that same emphasis on dignity. It would certainly make our founders very proud. So please consider the Korea Society a home for you in New York and for your efforts. And we're very honored to have you here. And to borrow from W.H. Auden and one of his great poetic phrases, an affirming flame. You are an affirming flame, and that of the government in terms of what you're doing on this front. And what all those, Michael Kirby and others, who have done such a tremendous job on this UN Commission of Inquiry report, it has elevated the dialogue to a new phase, and one that you're inviting us to sit up, take strong note of, and to act upon. And that's a very valuable message. We'd like to thank those in the Korea Society who have made this possible, in particular Nikita Desai, our Director of Policy and Corporate. We would invite you to please look at the new show in our gallery on the way out, and to please look for our new fall calendar, which will be out in August, for continued dialogue on policy and arts fronts. And we appreciate your support of the Korea Society and hope that if you're not a member, you please visit us at koreasociety.org and sign up. We will have some time here with the ambassador here at the end, and his schedule is tight, so we would ask you to please keep your observation short. We would also like to extend to you a special thank you gift, this on a recent exhibition called Traces of Life, and certainly your efforts complement the type of imagery that you will see in here, and we thank you again for returning to the Korea Society. Ladies and gentlemen, Ambassador Lee Jung-hoon. Thank you.
Thank you.